Federation Sergey Vasilyevich Vershinin. Good afternoon, Sergey Vasilyevich.
Good afternoon.
Yes, thank you for taking the time and opportunity to talk to journalists today. And today, we are talking about the results of the participation of the Russian delegation in the high-level weeks of the 79th session of the UN General Assembly. And, of course, we will talk about topical issues that are now on the agenda of both the UN Security Council and the General Assembly. You have the floor, Sergey Vasilyevich.
Thank you very much. I think it is a great honor and pleasure for me to meet here again. Following the results of, as you said, the high-level week of the 79th plenary session of the UN General Assembly, meetings have become traditional, and this is probably right and good. The session has just begun. It will go on for many, many months, but already now. It is a high-level week with the participation of the Russian delegation headed by Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, of course. Very indicative from the point of view of both the issues and the communication that took place in New York. And I would say that probably the main conclusion that we can draw today is that the high-level week showed that this is the desire. The transition of the movement towards multilateralism, towards ensuring that every country, regardless of its size, is respected, so that its voice sounds worthy. This week I have demonstrated this well. There is such a movement. And to this, in fact, all our activities and the activity of being in New York were subordinated. I will be happy to answer questions in connection with this event and, in general, on those topical issues of a regional, international nature that were discussed in New York and are currently being discussed in New York.
Sergey Vasilyevich, how do you assess the work of the Russian delegation in general, a fiver?
It's probably not great to tell myself, of course, it's not very good, but it seems to me that we can have a sense of satisfaction with how this high-level week went. The Russian delegation has really worked very intensively, a lot, and it seems to me that in this sense, he can be satisfied with the results. Not only this year's results, these are traditional debates and traditional activities during the high-level week, when a lot of leaders from most countries of the world gather in New York, who seek to discuss the most pressing issues and problems both for themselves and for the world. And that is why our voice, the way we manage to convey our points of view, coinciding, by the way, with the opinion of the global majority in the world, it must have been very important and significant.
Did the Russian delegation have any difficulties with organizing the visit and obtaining visas? Traditionally, what happens?
What is traditionally called, and what we always say, is that from the point of view of attending such events in the United States, we cannot be satisfied, because problems with obtaining visas continue all the time. In violation, by the way, of those agreements. Provisions on how a country hosting the central organs of the United Nations should behave in relation to member countries. Unfortunately, Washington is trying to use for its political purposes, I mean precisely such logistical issues, visa issuance issues. We consider this unacceptable. This time, I can confirm, for example, that a visa was not given to a member of the Russian official delegation. The head of the State Duma Committee of Russia, Leonid Eduardovich Slutsky, and a number of other people. The work has just begun. The first committee has started the work of the General Assembly, and here too, not all of our representatives have received visas. I think this is unacceptable. We're talking about it. We are talking about this persistently, actively in the Committee on Relations, with the country hosting the central bodies of the United Nations. And finally, we raised the question of the main thing, the need for arbitration. which is provided for again by the provisions of the agreement between the United States and the United Nations, about which I spoke.
Sergey Vasilyevich, what are the main tasks facing the Russian diplomacy at the 79th session of the General Assembly, which has just begun?
Well, I would probably say that the tasks stem from the global tasks of our foreign policy, our diplomacy, namely, confirmation. And work is quite consistent, intensive, with a huge majority, in the interests of moving towards a multilateral world. To a world where there are and work on equal terms, based on taking into account their legitimate interests and concerns. All countries of the world, without exception, where there is not what we have seen in recent years when, strictly speaking, a narrow group of people, not people, maybe people, primarily countries led by the United States, essentially tried to bend the global agenda under themselves, but it did not work out, and did not it will work.
По существу пытались подмять под себя глобальную повестку, а этого не получилось и не получится.
And that's exactly what the idea of a high level showed. It seems to me that in this sense, the main tasks remain, which we solved well. The task, which is to get away from the monopolization of a narrow group of Western countries, led by Washington, of the international agenda, in order to preserve the foundations laid down at the time of the activities, of the functioning of the United Nations as the central organization of an international world organization, based on its fundamental principles and goals, which are set out in the UN Charter, and to do this in interrelation, and in the fullness of all these principles and provisions contained in the UN Charter.
Sergey Vasilyevich, returning to the high-level week, can you say a few words about the meeting that was held on the sidelines of the General Assembly? And how was the meeting of the BRICS foreign ministers held on the eve?
You know, there have been a lot of meetings. There are traditionally a lot of them. It turns out that every day was filled with a lot of meetings. In total, the minister had about 30 bilateral meetings and many multilateral meetings, and of such an interesting caliber, of a good scale. I am referring to the ministerial meetings of the G20, the ministerial meetings of the group of friends of the UN Charter, the BRICS, which we have just mentioned, the Afghan Quartet, meetings in the Astana format. These are multilateral formats, but of course, they required a lot of serious work. Therefore, from this point of view, these meetings are short, concise, dynamic. But we imagine that when I name the number of these meetings, we are talking about 3 or 4 working days. That the Russian ministerial delegation held in New York, this is a really tight schedule. It seems to me that another feature of these meetings is that they are very productive, and it is not necessary to hold long meetings. It is effective to know that there is an exchange and certain agreements are being reached, which we are now carrying out live. As for the BRICS ministerial meeting, a long and good discussion. Probably, its peculiarity is that this ministerial meeting was on the eve of the summit that we will soon have in Kazan. And I pressed something. And there was such a frank, good discussion, including about how BRICS should improve its efficiency. You know that one of the features of probably today's period, in addition to the fact that this year is being held under representation in Russia, is the huge interest of a number of countries in being in the BRICS or being close to the BRICS. And this is where the concept of BRICS partners comes from. This was all discussed in conjunction with common approaches, with the development of common approaches in terms of reforming the UN, reforming the Security Council, in terms of such very serious key regional issues, of which there were actually many at the high-level week.
You mentioned the reform of the UN and the Security Council. These are the positions taken by the permanent members of the Security Council, primarily Russia, on increasing the number of permanent members. If there is consensus, which of the countries of the Global South can become new permanent members?
You know, we are going to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the victory next year. It's a big celebration. This is a great holiday for us as a country, for all the people. But this is also a very serious date from the point of view of international relations. It was the victory over fascism that became the basis for the creation of the UN. But many years have passed. Today we live in a different time, and, of course, the UN needs to adapt to modern conditions. We need to take into account the fact that many new centers of power are emerging, and the voice of new states, relatively new, but the states of Africa, Asia, and Latin America should be better taken into account and heard. It is clear that the reform of the UN Security Council as a whole is overdue, and it is being discussed. It has been discussed in New York for a number of years in the framework of intergovernmental negotiations. They are underway, and the last time in August it was decided to postpone these intergovernmental negotiations to next year. We believe that it is very important to reach consensus, the broadest possible agreement of the countries, with regard to the reform of the Security Council. There's too much at stake. Too much. The Security Council is the central body that determines and resolves issues related to the maintenance of peace and security. There should be no mistakes here. There is a very serious discussion going on today about who can join such a Security Council in what capacity. With the expansion of the Security Council, as permanent members, non-permanent members, membership categories, what to do with the beta right. I designate these issues as the most important, probably, from the point of view of not only the current situation, but the situation for years to come. That is why we are speaking very frankly and honestly today, both during these negotiations and at all levels. You know how many statements have been made at the official level by the Foreign Minister of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that we need a reform that would take into account the positions of most countries. I was talking about the consensus or the overwhelming majority of countries. And this means that what some people dream of, namely, let's say, to promote to the Security Council, some other member countries of the military political alliances already known to us, NATO, the European Union. For us, this is unacceptable. It will be a flawed decision. We believe, and we say this officially, publicly, that such powerful countries, respected countries like India, like Brazil, of course, they deserve to become new permanent members of the Security Council. But we also have, probably, a very important problem of underrepresentation in Africa. And here we believe that this issue must be resolved. It is necessary to expand the representation of Africa. How to do it? The parameters of such a decision should be decided by the Africans themselves, and we will support them. As for Western countries, and you know what countries like Japan and Germany are called, we also say frankly and honestly that we will be against it because it will not make the Security Council more effective, more objective. After all, in fact, let's be honest, the teams come from Washington, from Brussels. And these teams are being selflessly carried out by the current composition of the Western countries of the Security Council. Therefore, very often, the Western collective community, what we say is the collective West, does not even need to apply beta law. There are more of them in the Security Council, plus work with a number of other countries. And this, of course, it seems to us, should be taken into account. In this sense, our position is both principled, consistent, and honest, as I have already said.
Sergey Vasilyevich, you said that it is necessary to adapt it to modern conditions, but in its current form, it is capable of making collective efforts to solve global international problems.
Well, I would say that it should be, and now we repeat it all the time, a platform for coordinating the interests of all states. In the end, the UN-member states decide. This is not some kind of global government, not some kind of supranational structure. It is a structure that unites member countries, sovereign member countries. They decide, here's how to find this solution, achieve it. We have been working out many decisions that are being made at the UN venues. It is going on for a very long time. It is difficult, but it still needs to be continued. Therefore, it is important to rely on the principles and foundations, the fundamental things of the UN Charter, which were laid at the time of the formation of this world organization. If this is not the case, well, probably, then there will be no solutions. Because I said about coordination, it means dialogue. But very often, especially today, especially in recent years, we see that people do not want to talk, do not want to have a dialogue, just state their positions, some demands, and do not want to reach compromise solutions. It takes both time and desire. And if so, then, of course, today, let's say, a very often used move with Western countries is to submit some problem or issue to the Security Council for consideration, if they fail to twist everyone's hands there. You know that both we and the People's Republic of China, we do not hide and act in accordance with our interests. And we cannot allow such decisions that contradict our interests, the interests of security and peace. Then the Western collective goes to the General Assembly, a decision is made. An example of such decisions, probably we all remember, is the launch of special sessions on Ukraine a few years ago. In February of the 22nd year, when, through pressure, blackmail, and we know about it, a majority is being recruited in relation to developing countries, which makes a decision. But these decisions of the General Assembly, they are advisory in nature. And, of course, in this sense, such decisions are imposed through blackmail, threats against a number of countries of the Global South. It seems to me that such decisions, they do not add anything either to collective security or to any kind of security in any region of the world.
You mentioned Ukraine, and in what context was the situation in Ukraine discussed at the 79th session of the General Assembly? Were there any constructive proposals to regulate the Ukrainian crisis?
I would say to know that Ukraine, if we take the last high-level week, the previous year, according to the previous year, is a fading topic. We haven't heard anything new about the Ukrainian plot. There was Zelensky, there were attempts to promote him somehow at various meetings and forums, but we didn't hear anything new. We have not heard a real desire to resolve the problem. Again, all this revolved around those ultimatum demands for Russia, which contain the so-called Zelensky peace formula, which, of course, were unacceptable, but there was nothing real. But, again, I repeat, if we take this year, last year, the year before last, then we see a fading of interest in this problem, which, of course, is periodically inflamed by Western countries for their own selfish, Russophobic purposes.
Sergey Vasilyevich, great attention is paid in the United Nations, in the Security Council, to the situation in the Middle East. The 79th session was no exception, especially against the background of violence in the region. Why, as it seems to you, the world community still fails to come to a consensus decision and start the process for escalation? You have already partially talked about this, that there are positions of the collective West. But still, from your point of view, what share of the blame for the fact that this crisis continues lies with the United States? And yet, are the United Nations capable of preventing a large-scale war in the region?
The situation in the Middle East, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in the Middle East as a whole, of course, could not but be discussed at the high-level week and should be discussed. Because the messages, the information that comes from this region, of course, causes a serious, dramatic sense of perception of a big disaster for the region. Tens of thousands of people died, hundreds of thousands were injured, became refugees, temporarily displaced persons. And there was a discussion of the Middle East. It was at a ministerial meeting of the Security Council, with the participation of Sergey Viktorovich Lavrov, that our minister touched upon this issue in his speech at the General Assembly on the 28th. And here it is clear to us that a terrible tragedy is actually happening. We just celebrated the anniversary of the 7th. We did not celebrate, but took note of the anniversary of the 7th of October, the Hamas terrorist attack on Israeli citizens, which, of course, is condemned, but also cannot but be condemned, those attempts to collectively punish the Palestinians in Gaza. I have just given examples. The figures of the killed and wounded are perceived with great, great pain. This is really a tragedy that had to be stopped. And we need to stop today. And Russia has been striving to do this from the very beginning. From the very beginning, we clearly said, the President of Russia said, a ceasefire. We have repeated this many times, about the need for a ceasefire, of course, with the release of hostages, with the transition to finding a reliable political settlement in the Middle East. Therefore, here in this sense, our line was absolutely clear and crystal clear. It didn't work out. It didn't work out. Again, it's also clear why. Because, well, about 5 times the Americans used the right of veto in different circumstances. And we do not have a decision of the Security Council, which can make such a decision on a ceasefire, say, in the Gaza Strip. Because the Americans did not allow us to do this. Instead, we received vague explanations about the fact that there is a Biden plan that no one has fully understood, and that has not been implemented. We had statements about the need, American and French statements about the need for a truce between Hezbollah and Israel, in the Lebanese direction. All this has not been developed. And this, of course, is very sad. Therefore, our line here in this sense, it is clear, it is consistent. We need a ceasefire. We need to ensure the security of all states, including Israel in this region, but also other states. It is necessary to implement the right of the Palestinians to self-determination and to build their independent state, which is recorded in numerous decisions. Without this, of course, nothing can be done. And by and large, we are essentially balancing somewhere at the level of transition into a large-scale regional war. Because everyone knows which countries and which forces are involved in this conflict in the Middle East today. Unfortunately, the fact that the Security Council could not and still cannot, because of the US position, take steps and measures that would put an end to the ongoing bloodshed, stop the violence, is very regrettable. And it actually undermines the prestige of the UN today.
Это вызывает большое сожаление, и это подрывает на самом деле престиж ООН сегодня.
Sergey Vasilyevich, the Summit of the Future was held within the framework of the 79th session of the General Assembly. That's how you assess the holding of such a large-scale event.
The Summit of the Future was a really big event. In fact, he started a high-level week. Our delegation took part in the Summit for the Future, but it is probably even more important that we took part in drafting the documents that we would like to adopt at the Summit for the Future. The Summit of the Future has been held now, but preparations for it began at least 2 years ago, after the appeal of the UN Secretary-General in 2021 year about the need for a new agenda for the future. As a result of these consultations, which lasted, as I said, for almost 2 years, we came to the development of documents: a pact for the future, a digital global compact, and a declaration for future generations. All of this place forms the documents that this forum was supposed to adopt. But accept how? Here, we would also like to remind you of a very important thing. There was a Gen resolution. We are talking about the preparation of this big event, this forum. And there was written a very serious provision to accept by consensus. This means that everyone must agree. This means that you are always working on text, making corrections, and looking for some kind of joint compromise. This could not be done. We said in a concrete way that the co-coordinators who acted to coordinate all this preparation of these documents, which I have just told you about, they, of course, probably did not fully fulfill their role, the role of finding compromise formulations. In fact, it probably sounds quite strange, but there was not a single real face-to-face meeting. A meeting to discuss the documents that were being worked out. In other words, we have submitted amendments. Other countries have submitted amendments. We have submitted dozens of amendments to all these documents in all parameters. And we were not heard. We were not heard. Therefore, in the end, we distanced ourselves from the results that I told you about. We distanced ourselves from the consensus. We allowed the adoption of these documents. We have no complaints about the first 2 documents. We have no complaints about the declaration for the future generation. Because on the contrary, how would it be possible to work out such formulations that satisfied everyone? But we had serious contradictions on the first 2 documents. Because these are such serious detailed documents, dozens of pages. Speaking by and large, we considered it necessary to consolidate the interstate nature of the UN, to prevent the involvement of various types of NGOs at the same level as the state, to preserve the sovereignty and respect for the sovereignty of each of the parties. We wanted to prevent digitalization. I was talking about a global digital treaty to reduce the digital divide. And it exists today. We would like to avoid the dominance of such serious global digital giants that exist and work on the Western side. To prevent everything from being built in a digital environment on their order. It didn't work out. But here I will add another, probably very important thing too. These are the documents that have been adopted. They are in the form of recommendations. In other words, there is no automatism from what was achieved there and approved for transfer to other UN documents. And there will not be.
Его нет и не будет.
In other words, each time we will consider it at the intergovernmental, interstate level and seek consensus.
In other words, the adoption of these documents, in fact, does not mean anything, but I would still like the Russian amendments to be taken into account, and we relied on it.
They were not taken into account. I said that during these 1.5 years, we have given dozens of amendments in all these areas, on human rights issues, on disarmament, on everything. The documents are very detailed. Since they were not heard, and there was no real discussion when compromises could be sought, we distanced ourselves. But again, the adoption of documents does not mean anything. It is not mandatory for inclusion in any subsequent documents. On the NAON sites, we will be very strict about this every time.
Thank you, Sergey Vasilyevich. I still have questions, but the journalists in the audience have questions, so I suggest that my colleagues join the conversation. To the second row, please. Microphone. Wait for the microphone, then submit and ask questions.
Dear Sergey Vasilyevich, my last name is Linik Alexander. The Business Newspaper Guide to International Business has not yet been forgotten in the continuation of your answer. Russia did not block the Russian delegation at this summit, which you led at this high-level event. But at the same time, with 6 countries, it objected to this pact, and 13 countries abstained. There are some 143, in my opinion, voted for, most likely under pressure from the SSA. Please tell me, distancing yourself from the consensus on the Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Treaty, what is the main feature buried in the fact that there is a very gross violation in this pact, namely the uninterference in the internal affairs of countries, and the development of cooperation between these countries with other countries? This is the extreme minus, which probably angered the Russian delegation very much. And not only this minus, you have just told, there of course it would be possible to disclose this package of a 30-page document, a pact on the future, but you have very clearly clarified the position. Please, regarding the interference, non-interference of the UN in the internal affairs of countries. This is extremely important for all UN countries. Maybe those 143 countries do not yet understand that they are being threatened. Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. By the way, you said a very precise figure, 143. 143, after all, we proposed an amendment. You have also reflected the meaning of the amendment. In other words, the amendments were, in fact, the wording from the UN Charter, that it does not interfere in the internal affairs of states, and that there is no duplication on the UN platforms of what has already been done. Here is the meaning of the amendment. What else is the meaning of the amendment? When we are going, I really was on behalf of Moscow. When we gather, words are given to everyone. In our word, we must offer our position with you and tell you why. In order, perhaps, we could have risked not being the first to give such a word, because we are talking about a summit. There were a lot of real heads of state and government. Since we proposed the amendment I am talking about, and which, as you correctly said, was supported by several countries, we were given the floor first to tell the amendments. And we took advantage of this to convey our assessments, balanced but justified, to everyone who was sitting in the hall, and who could then not sit at subsequent meetings. I was in this one too. It's so tactical, but I think it's such a good move. One more thing, since we are talking about a party for the future. For us, this was also taken into account by us taking decisions, the opinion of the majority countries, the global majority, that we are talking about. Since many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America spoke in favor of these agreements, we did not destroy them on their own. We respect the reasons they supported it. I believe that in general, In this sense, this work is not simultaneous. We have expressed our attitude. Then all these documents live their own lives. I said we would discuss them. And we will talk to all countries, conveying our own opinion. Let's say this is one of the formulations that we objected to, and one of the reasons for distancing. It was written about the need to increase funding for the Human Rights Council. He is already overly politicized. But if this trend continues, it's because, as always, a certain line is being built brick by brick on international platforms. And we need to see where in time. This is a simple solution, so far without numbers, without everything, where it will lead, we see, and we explain to others.
Thank you, colleagues. Any more questions? On the third row of the microphone, please introduce yourself.
Hello. Semyon Alexandrov, the tape? Ru, I have such a question. A member of the Russian delegation, Senator Karasin, following the results of the General Assembly, he said that he felt that everyone at the General Assembly was tired of the team of Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky. Tell me, please, how do the strange members of the UN feel about the Ukrainian leader and his so-called peace plan? Well, it's probably better to ask these countries, but my observation is that I haven't actually seen Zelensky. The Ukrainian delegation went there, but I didn't see them. I have already said that there is a certain fading of interest in this problem. Not because I don't want to find a solution to it. And you know that we always say that we are in favor of finding a settlement, taking into account the new realities. All this is understandable, taking into account the fundamental interests of Russia, taking into account the root causes of the conflict. The causes of the crisis, they are also known. By the way, Sergey Lavrov spoke about this in great detail, about his speech, and then at a press conference. Because we should forget that human rights have been violated absolutely in this case with regard to Ukraine. The rights of Russian-speaking people, Russians to the legal use of the language, and so on, and so on. Human rights, which are written down at the very beginning of the UN Charter. This is completely wrong. This means a complete disregard for the principles and fundamental foundations of the UN Charter. But as for the attitude, I say that I would probably agree that this fatigue is not from Ukraine, but fatigue from the imposition of a Western model or a Western vision of what is happening around Ukraine. This is what it is. Because the repetition of the same statements, divorced from reality, in fact. I think that these are the countries of the global majority that we are talking about, which, as I understand it, you are also asking about, is very tiring and increasingly annoying.
Thank you, colleagues. Any more questions on the site? Ivan Vasilyevich, we have been working for almost 45 minutes, but there are still questions that we received through the website. I'm not going to read out all the questions, especially those that you have already, in fact, answered before. Nikolai Stolyarov, allies, the recent discussion in the UN Security Council of the terrorist attack on the Nord Stream will have a legal continuation. Does Russia intend to appeal to international judicial authorities to call to account the true perpetrators, the United States? Can we count on the support of the affected side of Germany or not?
This is a serious issue, and we take it very seriously. We have raised this issue in the Security Council several times in the last 2 years. We proposed to make a resolution. We proposed to make a statement of the Security Council. The last time, just a few days ago, we talked about the need for a statement by the Security Council on this issue. Moreover, if we talk about the widely advertised proceedings, which are allegedly conducted by Denmark, Sweden, and Germany, we do not see any traces of this trial. Therefore, we pose the question in a different way. We say that there is an extremely serious strike of a terrorist nature against the strategic energy grid. which allowed Europe, in general, to develop confidently in last year's years.
которое позволяло Европе, в общем-то, уверенно развиваться в прошлогодние годы.
I am referring to gas supplies from Russia. And this terrorist attack should be evaluated. That is why we are raising the issue of an international investigation. And at the same time, we get either silence or a complete unwillingness to deal with this issue in return. So again, I say that our attempts to pass a resolution corresponding to the Security Council and get a reaction from the Security Council, and the reaction means that it must be consensual. The last time, on the 4th of October, they encountered a clear negative rejection from Western countries, primarily the United States, but also other Western countries. And this, of course, you know, as there is an expression, the thief's hat is on fire. Probably, this is also about that.
Thank you. Portal of Knowledge of Power, Oleg Makarov. It seems that only the Russian delegation was outraged by Israel's decision to make the UN Secretary General persona non grata. Was there a continuation of this story? And which of the states joined Russia?
Well, you know, to be honest, I don't remember that there were cases of this kind in this history of ours. For the first time it happened when a member state says that the Secretary General of this organization is the person of the award on its territory. Therefore, naturally, we had in mind the elaboration of a certain position, including the Security Council on this matter. And this decision was made. It was, of course, under the influence of other countries, slightly softened in terms of criticism of the one who made such a decision. But nevertheless, we believe that this is the position of the Security Council, which is reflected, and which reflects the approach of all member states of the Security Council, that it is necessary to create conditions for the work of the UN Secretary General, including in terms of his movements. I believe that this position has received the support of the Security Council. It's significant.
Evening Petersburg, Nina Mordasova. There was information that the Secretary General, he will take part in the BRICS summit in Kazan. If the UN and BRICS joint projects are planned, maybe, can he get observer status in BRICS?
Well, as I said, today I stopped at a meeting, a ministerial meeting of the BRICS countries in New York. We are going to a big event, the summit in Kazan. And it seems to me that this really will probably be the event of the year in terms of its significance, political resonance, and decisions taken. Many countries have been invited there, and the UN Secretary General, who is expected in Kazan, has also been invited there. Therefore, I think that for him, it will be such an interesting communication in essence, with a very noticeably gaining authority pole of power in international relations. From the point of view of some common projects. It's too early to talk about any projects now. First of all, now we are going, especially this year, the year of Russia's presidency in the BRICS. We have a very serious adjustment of interaction between, as they say, the old BRICS members and the new BRICS members, in terms of coordinating their actions politically and in other areas as BRICS members. It is good for the UN if it gets the full picture, including directly through the presence of the UN Secretary General in Kazan, about the orientation of this alliance. This is probably very important. It's probably premature to talk about any projects now.
Thank you, Sergey Vasilyevich. I have a question about a correspondent of Channel 1 who was deprived of accreditation because he approached the head of the German Foreign Ministry allegedly asked her an uncomfortable question. Now the problem is solved. The accreditation is being returned to journalist Valentin Bogdanov. This is largely due, in fact, to Russia's representation at the UN. But what needs to be done to ensure that this does not happen again? Maybe some scheme needs to be worked out.
Well, I would say you just need a respectful attitude towards journalists. In this particular case, both through Russia's means at the UN and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have spoken and acted very actively on this issue, and I think it had an impact on the outcome. And as for how such incidents can be prevented in general, the question, by and large, is not for us. We always have a respectful attitude towards all journalists. And here it is very important that there is not this selective approach in which some journalists are released, others are not. Here we need a universal approach and respect for what journalists do, including from the point of view of informing and shocking the public about what is happening.
Thank you. The publication of the Region in Touch raises the topic of food security. You have said that our country will continue the work of the UN on the access of Russian food to world markets. However, there has been no significant progress in 2 years. You say that it is wrong to assume that this is the fault of the UN. How is the interaction being built, and what progress has been achieved?
As you understand, we are talking about the implementation of the memorandum between Russia and the UN Secretariat on unhindered access of Russian agricultural products and fertilizers to the world market. This memorandum, I will say, it is valid until the middle of next year. It was concluded and signed for 3 years. We regularly meet with representatives of the UN, headed by the Director General of UNCTAD, Rebecca Greenspan, and hold consultations with us. We look at all the issues that exist on the agenda and the problems that prevent such access. And, of course, I have already talked about this, too. Of course, the hypocrisy of Western capitals is striking, because they always say that we have made sanctions against Russia, expand these sanctions. But these sanctions do not concern food issues, food security. Since we allegedly in Western capitals also think about food security in Russia. First of all, from the point of view of the interests of the global majority, I can say that this is not so. That, of course, the unilateral coercive measures and sanctions imposed are illegal. By the way, they, of course, hinder the export of Russian agricultural products and fertilizers. But from the point of view of its agricultural potential, especially in the production of fertilizers, it is probably the main link, the main condition for maintaining food security. Then here we clearly see the hypocrisy of Western capitals. The UN team, on behalf of the UN Secretary General, and in accordance with the memorandum, which, as I said, is valid until the middle of next year, is trying to ensure that such nodal problems are solved. I must say, and we have also been very honest about this, that it does not quite work out, because logistics issues, transaction issues are very complicated. Now we are continuing consultations. We see the efforts of the UN team, and at the same time we see that, by and large, the statements made about the freedom of access of our agricultural products and fertilizers to the world market by Western countries do not correspond to reality. It is this duality that we must try to overcome, but we must first understand this, and understand this hypocritical position of Western capitals. Therefore, we hope that the consultations, the continuation of the consultation, will yield some small fruits. We managed to solve several cases, but first of all, there are still those issues that we will continue to work on.
Sergey Vasilyevich, there is a question from Gennady Fishman. He wants to know how the current security situation affects the disarmament process. And I would probably add, are there any difficulties in the work of the UN First Committee, which is dealing with disarmament issues?
The First Committee has just started its meeting. It's a lot of hard work. I can say that our experts work extremely professionally. We proceed from the fact that disarmament issues should be promoted naturally, taking into account the interests of the Russian Federation. Unfortunately, we have not started a whole series of steps in recent years that have essentially collapsed the previously existing system of agreements in the field of disarmament. Here, in this case, the word is not ours. We are ready to really discuss these issues, again in accordance with our security interests. But, of course, we will not accept unilateral concessions, unilateral violations, and we will not tolerate them.
Thank you. Colleagues on the site, are there any questions left for our guest? Well, there is, please. Apparently, your question will be the final one.
One more question. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights recently released a report on the situation in Ukraine, telling about the torture of Russian fighters in Ukrainian captivity. Will this issue be discussed on the sidelines of the General Assembly? And what kind of work is being done by the Russian mission on this issue? Thanks for the question. First of all, I want to say that this report is not quite fresh. It has already been discussed. We have analyzed it. I also want to say that we regularly bring a very large amount of information to the UN representatives through Geneva, through our Geneva mediation, through our mediation in New York. And you know what crimes, unfortunately, the Kiev Nazis resort to with regard to the situation in Kursk and other places on Russian territory.
Нацисты в том, что касается ситуации в Курске, в других местах российской территории.
Including against the civilian population, but also against our prisoners of war. I can say that, unfortunately, the department you mentioned does not give an objective picture of what is happening. The report in which you quoted, there is little information about the atrocities used against our guys. But there are a lot of fabrications in terms of the actions of the Russian military. These fabrications, this biased presentation of information, despite, again, I repeat, the large volume of materials that we transmit almost daily through Geneva and New York, of course, cannot but cause at least misunderstanding and indignation. Unfortunately, we cannot talk about any objectivity in covering what is happening. In general, speaking about the work, again on human rights in the HERC, Mr. Turk, who now heads the department of the Third Committee at the UN General Assembly, we see that there is a very serious politicization of human rights issues on all platforms.
Третьего комитета на Генассамблее ООН мы видим, что идет очень серьезная политизация вопросов прав человека.
Literally, there is a list of countries that are being attacked all the time for political reasons, and very often biased. Therefore, we believe that it is necessary that the UN representatives of the UN Secretariat, not only in Geneva, but also in New York, strictly adhere to those requirements, the requirements of the UN Charter, in particular Article 100, that the UN representative is a representative, must be objective.
о том, что ООНовский представитель – это представитель должен быть объективным.
He should not have political preferences that could be dictated by his, let's say, nationality.
Его, допустим, национальной принадлежностью.
Unfortunately, we don't see this very often. But we insisted, and we will insist on it.
Thank you. Well, let's finish. I thank you, Sergey Vasilyevich, for taking the time to talk to journalists today. We are always glad to see you on our site. Well, until we meet again, goodbye.
Thank you very much.